She was a daughter of a failing duchy, a bartered bride, whose price was 30 wagons of grain and a fragile peace. Sent into the heart of the enemy kingdom of Eldoria, Eleonora expected a life of gilded irrelevance, a pretty ghost in the cold stone halls of the Wolf King Theron. He was her people's conqueror, a man forged in iron and shadow. Her purpose was to be a silent symbol of her father's surrender. What no one, least of all the calculating king himself, ever anticipated was that the quiet pawn would possess the one mind sharp enough to save his kingdom or topple his throne. The treaty was signed with ink the color of dried blood. Eleonora watched her father, Duke Godfrey of Westhaven, press his signet ring into the warm wax, his hand trembling just enough to betray the forced bravado in his posture. The parchment was a death warrant for her freedom, an invoice for her soul. In exchange for his daughter, Duke Godfrey would receive desperately needed grain from Eldoria and a temporary reprieve from the swords of its formidable king. A daughter for a duchy. It sounded almost noble if one didn't look too closely at the fine print. Eleonora felt nothing. The part of her that could feel had been hollowed out weeks ago, when the first whispers of the arrangement had slithered through the court. She was a commodity, the last valuable export of a land bled dry by her father's mismanagement and 2 seasons of relentless blight. Her journey north was a funeral procession for the life she had known. The green rolling hills of Westhaven, with its gentle sea breezes and familiar coastline, gave way to the sharp, unforgiving peaks of Eldoria's mountain ranges. The very air grew colder, thinner, as if reluctant to welcome her. She travelled in an ornate carriage, a gilded cage on wheels, attended by ladies-in-waiting, whose pitying glances were sharper than any dagger. They spoke to her in hushed tones, as if she were already a ghost. The capital city of Eldoria Citadel Eredor was carved from the heart of a mountain. It was a fortress of grey stone and black iron, a place of stark, brutalist beauty that cared little for comfort and everything for strength. It was a reflection of its king, King Theron, the Wolf of the North. She had heard the stories. A king who ascended the throne at 16 after his father fell in battle, a boy who had cemented his rule with blood and iron. He had never lost. A war had never been shown to possess an ounce of mercy. He had unified the quarrelsome northern clans and turned their fury outwards, expanding Eldoria's borders with ruthless efficiency. Westhaven was simply the latest to bend the knee rather than be broken entirely. Her arrival was met not with ceremony but with cold observation. She was escorted through endless stone corridors, the clicks of her shoes echoing in the oppressive silence. The court was assembled in the great hall, a cavernous space dominated by a throne hewn from a single piece of obsidian, and on it sat the king. He was not the monster of her imagination. Monsters were easy to hate. King Theron was something far more unsettling. He was magnificent. Tall and broad-shouldered, he wore no crown, only a simple circlet of black iron in his dark hair. His face was all sharp angles and severe lines, his eyes a startling shade of winter grey. They held an unnerving intelligence, a penetrating gaze that seemed to strip away her fine silks and practiced composure, seeing the terrified woman beneath. He didn't rise. He didn't smile. He simply watched her approach as a wolf might watch a deer stumble into its territory. Lady Eleonora of Westhaven, a herald, announced his voice, booming unnaturally in the hall. She sank into the deep curtsy she had practiced 1,000 times, keeping her eyes fixed on the polished stone floor. "Your Majesty." Silence. It stretched for an eternity, thick and heavy. She could feel the weight of 100 pairs of eyes on her, feel their judgment, their contempt for her weakened homeland. "Rise," his voice commanded. It was a low, resonant sound, like rocks grinding together. It held no warmth, only absolute authority. She rose slowly, forcing herself to meet his gaze. It was a mistake. Looking into his eyes was like looking into a winter storm. She saw power, intellect, and a profound weariness that was somehow more frightening than rage. "You are smaller than I expected," he said, his tone flat, analytical. He was assessing her as a horse trader assesses new stock. "Your father assured me of your agreeable nature." The unspoken word hung in the air, submissive. A spark of defiance, one she thought long extinguished, flickered within her. "My father is a man of many assurances, Your Majesty. His success with them varies." A murmur rippled through the court. It was not a sound of approval. Theron's stony expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. A flicker of interest, perhaps. Or was it annoyance? He gestured dismissively to a stern-faced woman at the foot of the throne. "Lady Beatrice will show you to your chambers. You will be provided for. Your duties for now are to remain unseen and unheard, a symbol of surrender." The words echoed in her mind. He didn't want a wife or even a companion. He wanted a trophy, a living embodiment of his victory over Westhaven. As Lady Beatrice led her away, Eleonora chanced one last look back. King Theron was no longer looking at her. He was speaking to a man at his side, a hawk-faced lord with cunning eyes, who glared at Eleonora with undisguised venom. She had already been dismissed. Her chambers were luxurious, a prison cell draped in velvet and silk. The windows, tall and arched, were barred with intricate ironwork. They overlooked a sheer drop down the side of the mountain. There was no escape. That night, Eleonora did not weep. Tears were a currency she could no longer afford to spend. She sat on the window seat, the cold stone seeping through her gown, and stared out at the alien constellations in the northern sky. She had been sold caged and dismissed. They expected her to be a docile little bird, singing a sad song of defeat until she faded away. They thought they knew her purpose. But as the moon cast long, menacing shadows across the mountains, Eleonora made a silent vow. She may be a pawn in their game, but she would learn the rules, and she would not be sacrificed without a fight. The Wolf King wanted her unseen and unheard. He would learn to regret that command. The days that followed bled into one another, a monotonous cycle of grey dawns and silent evenings. Eleonora's life in Citadel Eridor was one of structured emptiness. She was given lessons in Eldorian history by a dry, humourless tutor, taught the rigid court etiquette by the ever-present Lady Beatrice, and fitted for gowns of dark, sombre colours that seemed designed to make her fade into the stone walls. She was a ghost, haunting the edges of court life, perpetually present, but never acknowledged. The Eldorian court was a reflection of its king, disciplined, dangerous, and utterly without frivolity. The lords were warriors, their faces etched with the harshness of the northern climate and the brutality of past campaigns. The ladies were severe, their conversations revolving around politics alliances and the strength of bloodlines. There was no poetry here, no music, no laughter. There was only power. Eleonora quickly identified the main players. The hawk-faced man she had seen beside the king was his cousin, Lord Valerius. He was the leader of the war faction, a group of nobles who believed Theron's treaty with Westhaven was a sign of weakness. Valerius missed no opportunity to cast a sneer in her direction, his disdain a physical force. He saw her as the living symbol of a compromised victory. His followers echoed his contempt, their whispers following her like starving wolves. She learned to listen. In the vast echoing library, While pretending to read ancient texts, she listened to the scribes gossip. In the gardens, tucked away in a barren corner that was the only place she could find solitude, she listened to the guards complain. She learned of the fissures in Theron's council, the rivalries between the old clans, the precariousness of the grain supply, even here in the victorious north. She pieced together a tapestry of the kingdom, not from the dry lessons of her tutor, but from the discarded threads of everyday conversation. She saw the king only at a distance. He was a whirlwind of activity, constantly in council meetings, presiding over petitions, or training in the yard with his personal guard. He moved with a relentless, coiled energy, his presence dominating every space he entered. On the rare occasions his gaze passed over her, it was vacant, as if looking straight through her. She was a piece of furniture in his palace, a reminder of a treaty he had signed, and seemingly forgotten. The isolation was a weight on her soul, but her mind, starved for stimulation, grew sharper. Her father had, in one of his few moments of competent parenting, insisted she be educated alongside her brother. She understood logistics trade and the delicate art of diplomacy far better than anyone in this court of warriors suspected. She saw the flaws in their thinking, the arrogance that blinded them to their own vulnerabilities. Her first real interaction with the king since her arrival happened by chance. Fleeing the suffocating atmosphere of the court, she had sought refuge in the royal mews. The scent of hay and horse was a comforting reminder of home. She was stroking the velvet nose of a beautiful white mare when his voice cut through the quiet. She is not a pet. Eleonora spun around. King Theron stood in the stable doorway, silhouetted against the grey afternoon light. He was dressed for riding, not for court, and the absence of his formal tunic made him seem larger, more imposing. She withdrew her hand as if burned. "My apologies, Your Majesty." She reminded me of a horse I had at home. He walked towards her, his eyes on the mare. "This is Hecate. She has thrown every rider who has tried to break her, myself included." He ran a hand along the horse's powerful neck, his touch surprisingly gentle. The mare, who had been skittish moments before, leaned into his touch with a soft nicker. "She's not untamable," Eleonora said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. "She is frightened. Her saddle is positioned too far forward. It must be pinching her withers. And the bit you use is too severe for a sensitive mouth." Theron turned his head, his full attention on her for the first time. Those winter-grey eyes narrowed not with anger, but with a sharp, assessing curiosity. "You know horses. I grew up on the coast of West Haven, Your Majesty. We value our horses as much as our ships. A good mount is a partner, not a tool to be broken." He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. She expected a dismissal, a curt reminder of her place. Instead, he said, "Show me." Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was a test. With trembling hands, she approached the horse again, speaking to it in a low, soothing tone. She pointed to the faint chafe marks at the base of the mare's neck, the way the animal flinched when she applied pressure near the ill-fitting saddle. Her fear has been mistaken for aggression. She fights because she is in pain. Theron listened, his gaze shifting from her hands to the horse and back to her face. He was a man accustomed to seeing problems as things to be conquered, to be met with overwhelming force. The idea of solving a problem with empathy seemed entirely foreign to him. "The stable master is a veteran of 20 years, he stated, his voice a low rumble. "And I am sure he is an excellent master of horses," Eleonora replied, choosing her words with care. "But perhaps not of mares. They often require a different hand." He did not argue. He simply stood there watching her, a thoughtful, almost troubled expression on his face. Your accent has faded," he observed, changing the subject abruptly. "I am a quick study, Your Majesty, so I am beginning to see," he said, and the words held a new weight. He left without another word, leaving her alone in the mews with the thundering of her own heart. It was a small thing, a conversation about a horse, but it was the first time he had looked at her and seen a person, not a political pawn. The whispers in the court changed after that. They were no longer just about the pathetic bride from Westhaven. Now they were tinged with a new, sharper curiosity. Lord Valerius's glares intensified his animosity, growing with every rumour that the king had spoken to her. He and his allies saw any attention the king paid her as a dangerous distraction, an insult to the Eldorian blood that should be sitting beside the throne. Eleonora knew she was walking a knife's edge. To be noticed by the king was to become a target, but to remain invisible was to slowly wither and die. For the first time since arriving in this cold, brutal kingdom, she felt a flicker of something other than despair. It was a dangerous, thrilling sensation hope. She had caught the Wolf King's attention. Now she had to figure out how to survive it. Theron found his thoughts returning to the woman from Westhaven. It was an irritating and unwelcome distraction. For weeks, she had been a spectre at the edge of his court, a silent, beautiful reminder of a distasteful but necessary political compromise. He had intended for her to remain so. He had a kingdom to run, a restless council to manage, and the constant threat of famine to keep at bay. He had no time for the delicate creature his treaty had forced upon him. But her words in the stable had unsettled him. Her fear has been mistaken for aggression. She had spoken of the horse, but the sentiment echoed a deeper truth he was beginning to recognize in his own rule. He had always met challenges with force, crushed dissent with an iron fist. It was how his father had ruled and how he had survived. But it was a draining, relentless way to live. The grain from Westhaven's ports was a temporary solution. His kingdom was too mountainous, its growing seasons too short. He needed long-term trade, not endless conquest. But his council, led by the ever-ambitious Valerius, was drunk on victory. They clamoured for war, for the complete annexation of Westhaven, for the glories of battle. They saw his pragmatism as weakness. He began to watch Eleonora. He noticed things he hadn't before. The way she never simply sat, but always observed her intelligent eyes, missing nothing. The way she held herself with a quiet dignity that defied the court's contempt. He saw the sharp mind behind the placid mask she wore for her own protection. He decided to set a test. During a public audience where petitioners came before the throne, a dispute was brought forward by two merchants. One, a man named Corwin, accused the other of violating a trade agreement regarding lumber shipments from the southern forests. It was a tedious, convoluted affair, and Theron could feel his counsel's impatience. He let the arguments drone on his gaze, drifting over the assembled courtiers, until it landed on Eleonora, standing in her usual place near the back of the hall. "Enough," Theron said suddenly, his voice cutting through the merchant's whining. The hall fell silent. He fixed his gaze on Eleonora. "Lady Eleonora, your duchy relies on sea trade. You must have some familiarity with such disputes. What is your judgment here?" A collective gasp went through the court. To ask the foreign hostage for her opinion on an internal Eldorian matter was unprecedented. It was a calculated move, and everyone knew it. Lord Valerius's face darkened, his hand tightening on the hilt of his sword. Eleonora's composure was flawless. She did not look flustered or surprised. She simply inclined her head. "Your Majesty, I am a guest in your kingdom. It would be presumptuous of me to offer judgment. It is not a request. "It is a command," he said, his voice hard. He was pushing her, wanting to see how she would react under pressure. She paused for a heartbeat, gathering her thoughts. Then she moved forward, her steps measured and confident. She did not look at Theron but addressed the two merchants directly. Her questions were not about the broken contract, but about things no one else had thought to ask. She asked about the roads, the cost of transport, the health of the forests, the availability of laborers. Her inquiries were precise, logical, and stripped of all emotion. Within minutes, she had unraveled the core of the problem. It wasn't a broken contract, it was a failing logistical chain. The roads were in disrepair from the last winter, and the lumber guilds were demanding higher wages, making the original agreement unprofitable. Turning to the throne, she gave her verdict. "The fault is not with either man, your majesty. The fault lies in the infrastructure that supports their trade. They made a deal based on conditions that no longer exist. I would suggest the contract be voided. Further, I would suggest a portion of the crown's tariffs be invested in road repair and a negotiation with the guilds to prevent such disputes in the future. A kingdom's true wealth is not in its treasury, but in its ability to move goods and services efficiently." Silence. Absolute, stunned silence. She had not only solved the immediate problem, but had offered a piece of long-term policy advice that was both sound and sensible. She had done it publicly, without a hint of arrogance, framing it as a simple observation. Theron stared at her, a slow, unfamiliar feeling rising in his chest. It felt like admiration. He had spent months arguing with his council about this very issue, his calls for internal investment, shouted down by their demands for more military spending. And this woman, this political prisoner, had articulated his own position more clearly and concisely than he ever could. A wise and equitable solution, Theron announced, his voice ringing with authority. He turned to a clerk. "See, it is done. The contract is voided. Begin a review of the trade infrastructure immediately." He looked back at Eleonora, and for the first time, he allowed a flicker of approval to show in his eyes. "Well done, my lady." The court was in an uproar. As Eleonora retreated to her place, she could feel the daggers in their stares. Lady Beatrice looked pale with shock. Lord Valerius's expression was murderous. He strode to the throne as soon as the audience was dismissed. "Your Majesty, what was that?" Valerius hissed, keeping his voice low but venomous. "To allow that West Haven whore to lecture us on governance. It is an insult to every Eldorian in this hall. She spoke the truth." "Valerius," Theron replied calmly, though his own heart was beating faster than he would admit. "Something you and your warmongering friends seem to have forgotten how to recognize. She is manipulating you. Can you not see it? She plays the part of the clever little mouse to gain your favor. She is an enemy in our midst. She is my charge," Theron countered his voice, dropping to a dangerous growl. "And you will remember that. She offered sound counsel, which is more than I have received from you of late. Your counsel begins and ends with 'spill more blood.' I am growing tired of it." The confrontation left a chasm between the two cousins. Theron knew he had crossed a line. By publicly elevating Eleonora, he had thrown down a gauntlet to the old guard. He had made her a symbol of his new way of thinking, and in doing so, had painted a target squarely on her back. Later that day, he sent a gift to her chambers, a collection of books. They were not poetry or romance, but treatises on Eldorian law, economics, and engineering. There was no note. There didn't need to be. It was a message, an acknowledgement. He was no longer content for her to be unseen and unheard. He was inviting her into the game. Eleonora held the heavy tomes in her hands, a thrill of fear and excitement coursing through her. The gilded cage had just become a great deal larger and infinitely more dangerous. The king had made his move. Now it was her turn to play. The king's favor was a dangerous gift. It granted Eleonora a measure of respect she had been denied, but it also sharpened the hostility of her enemies. She was no longer just the foreign bride. She was the king's confidant, the whisperer in the shadows. Lord Valerius and his faction now viewed her not with mere contempt, but with strategic hatred. She was an obstacle to their ambitions. Theron began summoning her to the royal library under the guise of discussing the books he had sent. The library, with its towering shelves and scent of aged paper, became their sanctuary. It was a neutral ground, where he was not entirely a king, and she was not entirely a hostage. At first their conversations were formal, focused on matters of state. He was fascinated by her perspective. She saw his kingdom through the eyes of an outsider, pointing out inefficiencies he had long overlooked. She spoke of crop rotation of maritime trade routes, of fostering guilds, ideas that were radical in a land built by the sword. You think of a kingdom as a body. Valerius thinks of it as a weapon, she observed one evening, tracing the map of Eldoria's coastline with her finger. A weapon must always be pointed at something. A body must be nourished to survive. He watched her, captivated by the fire in her eyes when she spoke of such things. And what do I think of it, as he asked, his voice softer than he intended? She looked up, meeting his gaze. I think you see it as a burden, Your Majesty. A legacy of blood you are not sure you wish to continue, but don't know how to escape. Her perception was so accurate, it felt like a physical blow. No one had ever dared speak to him with such honesty. His counselors flattered him, his enemies feared him, but no one saw him. No one saw the weight of the crown, the ghosts of the men he had killed, the crushing responsibility of holding a nation together. It was in that moment that the dynamic between them shifted irrevocably. The political fascination began to bleed into something personal, something deeper. He started to see not just the sharp mind, but the woman who wielded it. He noticed the slight curve of her lips when she was puzzling through a problem, the way she tucked a stray strand of auburn hair behind her ear, the quiet strength that radiated from her. One rain-lashed night, he found her in the library staring into the fireplace. There was a profound sadness in her eyes, a vulnerability she rarely allowed to show. A message came from Westhaven today, he said, gently, moving to stand beside her. He had seen the courier and suspected the news was not good. She flinched but did not turn. My younger brother, Thomas. He has the lung fever. The Meisters say he will not last the winter. He knew of her affection for her brother. It was the one soft spot her father had been able to exploit. He felt a surge of an emotion he couldn't name, a desire to comfort her, to ease her pain. It was an impulse he had suppressed his entire life. I am sorry, he said the words, feeling clumsy and inadequate. She finally looked at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Why are you telling me this? To remind me of all I have lost. To show me how powerless I am, no. He said, his voice a low growl of frustration. I tell you because your grief is not a political tool. Here in this room it is simply grief. I will not have it used against you. He did something then that stunned them both. He reached out and gently brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. His touch was rough, calloused from years of wielding a sword, but the gesture was hesitant, tender. The contact was electric. It was the first time they had touched outside of formal ceremony. Eleonora froze her breath, catching in her throat. The formidable, untouchable king was offering her a moment of genuine human connection. The armor he wore, the one forged of duty and violence, had cracked, and through it she saw a glimpse of the man beneath a man who was lonely burdened, and perhaps as much a prisoner of his station as she was of hers. She didn't pull away. She leaned into his touch just for a second, a silent acceptance of his comfort. The space between them crackled with unspoken emotions, with the dangerous, burgeoning possibility of something more. Theron, she whispered, using his name for the first time. It felt both scandalous and perfectly natural. He dropped his hand as if burned, stepping back. The kingly mask slammed back into place, but his eyes betrayed the turmoil within. "The hour is late, my lady. You should rest." He turned and left the library, his retreat more telling than any declaration. He was afraid. Afraid of the power she was beginning to have over him, of the way she was dismantling his defenses, one quiet observation, one honest conversation at a time. The court did not miss the change. The late-night meetings, the king's softened expression. When he looked at her, it was all fuel for the fire of gossip and intrigue. Lady Beatrice warned Eleonora in hushed, fearful tones. "You are playing with fire, my lady. The king is not a man to be tamed, and Lord Valerius is a serpent who will strike when you are least expecting it." Eleonora knew the risks. She knew that every step she took towards the king was a step into mortal danger. But she was no longer the frightened girl who had arrived in Eldoria. She had found her footing in this brutal land, and more than that, she had found a man whose mind was a match for her own, whose soul she was beginning to believe was not as dark as the world believed. She was falling for him, and for the chance to stand beside him as an equal, not a captive. She was willing to risk the serpent's bite. The serpent chose its moment with practiced precision. It began with a border skirmish, a small band of West Haven raiders or so, the reports claimed, had attacked an Eldorian outpost, killing 3 guards. The news swept through Citadel Eridor like wildfire, igniting the smouldering resentment of the war faction. Lord Valerius seized the opportunity, his voice thundering in the council chamber. "This is the fruit of your soft peace, my king." He roared, his hawk-like face contorted with fury. "We showed mercy, and they repay us with treachery. Their duke sends his daughter as a distraction, while his men sharpen their blades." Theron remained impassive. His hands steepled before him, but his mind raced. The attack was too convenient, too perfectly timed. It felt staged. "I will have a full report from the border, Captain," he said, his voice a low, dangerous calm. "We will not be goaded into a rash response." Rash Valerius laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. The only rash decision was trusting them in the first place. Trusting her. He pointed a damning finger towards the back of the chamber where Eleonora stood. All eyes followed. Eleonora felt the blood drain from her face. She had known this was coming. Valerius had been waiting for any excuse to move against her. "The Lady Eleonora has nothing to do with this," Theron stated, his voice like chipping ice. "Doesn't she?" Valerius sneered. He strode towards Eleonora, pulling a rolled parchment from his belt. "My men have been watching her. She is not the docile creature she pretends to be. She has been sending messages." He unfurled the parchment with a dramatic flourish. It was a letter written in a delicate hand she instantly recognized as a flawless imitation of her own. The letter was a masterpiece of treason. It spoke of the king's weaknesses, of the divisions in his council of troop movements, discussed in the privacy of the library. It detailed a plan to open a gate to West Haven soldiers during the upcoming winter festival, and ended with a chillingly intimate reference to poisoning the king's wine. It was signed with her name. A deathly silence fell over the council. The forgery was perfect. It contained details only someone with close access to the king could know, details Valerius could have easily gleaned from spies and gossip. "This is a lie," Eleonora said, her voice shaking but clear. "I have never seen this letter before." "Of course you would deny it," Valerius bellowed. "Seize her, search her chambers. You will find the proof you need." Theron's face was a mask of stone, but his mind was a maelstrom. Every instinct screamed that it was a trap, a fabrication by his ambitious cousin. But the evidence was damning. The details were specific. To ignore it would make him look like a fool, besotted and blinded by a foreign spy. His entire authority rested on his reputation for unyielding justice. "Guards." Theron said, his voice heavy with a reluctance no one else could hear. "Do as he says. Escort the Lady Eleonora to her chambers and conduct a thorough search." The guards moved forward, their faces grim. Eleonora looked at Theron, her eyes pleading with him to believe her. For a fleeting second his gaze met hers, and in their grey depths she saw not the fury of a betrayed king, but the agony of a trapped man. It was enough. The search of her rooms was brutally efficient. They tore apart her bed, emptied her wardrobes, and overturned her writing desk. And there, tucked into the spine of a book, one of the very books Theron had given her, they found a small vial of colourless liquid. The court physician, a man known to be loyal to Valerius, identified it immediately. Cantria root. Odourless, tasteless. A single drop in a cup of wine would be fatal within the hour. It is a poison favoured by West Haven assassins. The final nail was hammered into her coffin. The evidence was complete, irrefutable. Whispers turned to furious demands for her execution. Lord Valerius stood tall, his face a mask of righteous vindication. He had played his hand perfectly. Theron had no choice. To the court, to his kingdom, he had to be the king. Imprison her, he commanded, the words, tasting like ash in his mouth. The charge is high treason and attempted regicide. She will be held in the sky cells until a formal judgment is passed. The sky cells were the most notorious dungeons in Eldoria, carved into the highest, most exposed peak of the citadel, where the winds howled relentlessly. As the guards dragged her away, Eleonora did not scream or protest. She held her head high, her gaze locked on Theron. It was a look not of accusation, but of a strange, unwavering faith. She was trusting him to see the truth. The heavy iron door of the cell clanged shut, the sound echoing the closing of a tomb. Eleonora was left alone in the freezing dark, with only the shrieking wind for company. Valerius had won. He had successfully removed her from the board and put the king in an impossible position. If Theron spared her, he was weak. If he executed her, he would be killing the one person who had breached his defenses, the one person he was beginning to believe he could not live without. The serpent had struck, and the venom was spreading through the heart of the kingdom. Theron was now alone on the throne, more isolated than ever, with a choice that could save his crown or shatter his soul. The cold of the sky cell was a living thing. It seeped into Eleonora's bones, a relentless, numbing assault. The wind screamed through the single-barred slit in the stone, a constant, mournful cry. Days and nights blurred into a haze of shivering and fear. But beneath the fear, her mind was working, racing, refusing to surrender. She knew she had been framed. Valerius's plot was as elegant as it was evil. He had used their private meetings in the library, the very symbol of her influence, as the basis for his forgery. He had turned her strengths against her. She also knew that Theron was no fool. He would suspect his cousin, But suspicion was not proof. The king was a prisoner of his own laws. He needed a thread, something to pull on to unravel the entire conspiracy, and she would have to provide it. Her hope lay with a single, unlikely individual, Brother Michael, the elderly, stooped librarian who oversaw the royal collection. He was a quiet man who rarely spoke, but she had noticed his observant eyes. More importantly, she had always treated him with kindness and respect, discussing his beloved manuscripts with a genuine interest that the brusque Eldorian nobility never showed. She had shown him kindness, and now she prayed it would be returned. Her guard was a young, stony-faced soldier named Olin. For days he brought her meager rations of bread and water in silence. She tried to speak to him, but he refused to answer. Then one evening she saw him wince as he set down her tray, favoring his right arm. "Your shoulder," she said, her voice hoarse from disuse. "It's an old wound, isn't it? From the battle at Blackwater Pass. It aches when the air grows cold and damp." Olin froze his eyes wide with shock. How did you know I saw you in the practice yard?" Once she lied seamlessly. "I noticed the way you held your shield. My brother had a similar injury." She paused. "There is an ointment made from willow bark and wintergreen. It helps with the pain." The guard said nothing, but the wall of hostility in his eyes had cracked. The next day he lingered a moment longer. "They say you tried to poison the king," he mumbled, not looking at her. "The man who says that is the same man who sent your commander on a fool's errand at Blackwater Pass, costing dozens of lives," Eleonora said softly, taking a huge gamble. She had overheard gossip about Valerius's military recklessness in the library weeks ago. Lord Valerius cares for victory, not for the soldiers who win it for him. The shot hit its mark. Olin's face tightened. His own brother had died in that battle. "What do you want?" he whispered. A message. To Brother Michael in the library. Just 2 words: "Check the scribe." It was a desperate hope, based on a fleeting memory. During one of her sessions in the library, she had seen Valerius in a heated, whispered conversation with a junior scribe, a man with ink-stained fingers and fearful eyes, named Alaric. Valerius had passed him a heavy purse of coins. At the time, she'd thought nothing of it. Now it seemed like everything. Meanwhile, Theron was trapped in his own prison of statecraft. His council, whipped into a frenzy by Valerius, demanded a swift execution. To them, justice was simple and absolute. But Theron's gut, the same instinct that had guided him through a dozen battles, screamed that Eleonora was innocent. Her final look had not been one of a guilty conspirator, but of a queen placing her faith in her king. He could not openly defy his counsel. It would be seen as tyranny, a king placing his personal feelings above the law. He had to work from the shadows. He began his own clandestine investigation, starting with the border skirmish that had been the catalyst for the whole affair. He bypassed his regular chain of command, sending his most trusted personal scout, a man named Gregor, whose loyalty was beyond question to the outpost. Days later, Gregor returned under the cover of darkness, his report chilling. The Eldorian guards hadn't been killed by Westhaven raiders. They had been killed by Eldorian arrows fired from behind. The scene had been staged, the bodies arranged to look like the result of a battle. The lone survivor, a young archer, had been bribed and threatened by Valerius's men to support the official story. It was the first thread. At the same time, in the library, a terrified young guard passed a scrap of parchment to Brother Michael. 2 words: "Check the scribe." Michael, who held a quiet affection for the thoughtful foreign lady, understood. He remembered the scribe Alaric, a talented forger who was drowning in gambling debts. He also remembered seeing Valerius near Alaric's desk. Michael began to watch the scribe. He saw the new clothes, the expensive wine Alaric was suddenly drinking, and he saw the fear in the young man's eyes. Theron summoned the physician who had identified the poison. In the privacy of his solar, with two of his most loyal guards present, Theron's questioning was not that of a king, but of an interrogator. "The vial," he said, his voice deadly soft. "How did you know it was Countria root so quickly?" the physician blustered. "My expertise. Your Majesty, my mother was an expert herbalist." Theron cut in his voice, dropping another octave. "She taught me that Countria root is indistinguishable from 3 other common harmless herbs without a 2-day brewing test. You identified it in minutes. You knew what you were looking for. You were told what to find." The physician's face went white. Under the king's relentless pressure, his story crumbled. He confessed that one of Lord Valerius's household staff had given him the vial and told him where it would be planted and what he was to say. It was the second thread. Brother Michael, using his master key, entered Alaric's small chamber. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard, he found exactly what he expected: several sheets of parchment, with Eleonora's handwriting practiced over and over, and a half-empty bag of royal gold coins. The truth was no longer a suspicion. It was a certainty. Valerius had orchestrated everything: the border attack, the forged letter, the planted poison. It was a coup cloaked in the guise of justice, designed to remove Eleonora and push Theron into a war that would benefit Valerius and his allies. With the interlocking pieces of evidence in his hands, the scout's report, the physician's confession, and the forger's practice sheets, Theron was finally ready. He was no longer a king trapped by the law. He was a king ready to wield it as a sword. He would not just save Eleonora. He would bring the full, terrible weight of royal justice down upon the man who had threatened his kingdom, his throne, and his queen. Theron did not summon the council. He summoned the entire court. He ordered the great hall filled with every lord, lady, knight, and servant within the citadel walls. He stood before the obsidian throne, not as a ruler in crisis, but as a judge about to pass sentence. The atmosphere was thick with tension and anticipation. Lord Valerius entered with a confident stride, a triumphant smirk playing on his lips. He believed this was the final act, the public declaration of Eleonora's execution. He took his place of honor beside the throne, the loyal cousin, the savior of the kingdom. "Bring in the prisoner," Theron commanded. The great doors creaked open. Eleonora was escorted in by the royal guard. She was pale and thin from her ordeal in the sky cell, but she was not broken. She walked with her head held high, her gaze finding Theron's across the crowded hall. The silent communication that passed between them was one of trust and resolution. "Lord Valerius Theron," began his voice, echoing in the cavernous space. "You have brought a charge of high treason against the Lady Eleonora of Westhaven. You have presented evidence of a forged letter and planted poison. You have been fervent in your calls for justice. I have your Majesty Valerius said, puffing out his chest, for the good of Eldoria." "Indeed," Theron said, his voice turning to steel. "So fervent, in fact, that you orchestrated the entire plot yourself." A collective gasp swept the hall. Valerius's smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of panic. What is the meaning of this madness? The madness is a cousin who would murder his own countrymen and risk a war to further his own ambition, Theron retorted. He gestured to the side door. "Bring in the witnesses." First came the scout Gregor, who recounted the truth of the border skirmish, presenting the Eldorian arrows that had killed the guards. Then came the trembling physician, who confessed to planting the vial of poison on Valerius's orders. And finally Brother Michael stepped forward, accompanied by guards who dragged the terrified scribe Alaric. The librarian presented the practice sheets, the proof of Alaric's forgery, and Alaric himself fell to his knees, confessing that Valerius had paid his debts in exchange for penning the treasonous letter. Each testimony was a hammer blow, dismantling Valerius's scheme piece by piece. The lords who had supported him began to shrink away, their faces pale with the realization that they had backed a traitor. Valerius's face had turned ashen. He was cornered, exposed. Lies, all of it. He spat, his eyes wild. He drew his sword, a desperate final act of defiance. You are a weak king bewitched by a foreign snake. Eldoria needs a true ruler. Before he could take a step, Theron moved. He was no longer a politician or a judge. He was the wolf of the north, the warrior king. He descended the dais in 2 swift strides, his own sword clearing its scabbard with a sound like singing steel. The fight was brutally short. Valerius was a skilled swordsman, but Theron was a master, his movements a blur of deadly grace. A parry, a feint, and a final decisive thrust. Lord Valerius fell to the stone floor, his own treasonous blood pooling beneath him. Silence reigned. Theron stood over his fallen cousin, his chest heaving, his sword dripping. He had ended not just a man, but an era of endless bloody conflict. He turned to face his court, his people. His eyes were blazing. "Let this be the end of it," he declared, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "The plotting, the whispers, the hunger for needless war, it dies today. We will build this kingdom with trade, not terror. With prosperity, not pillage. This is my decree." He walked to where Eleonora stood, never breaking his gaze from hers. The crowd parted before him. He stopped in front of her, his expression softening, the warrior receding to reveal the man. He sheathed his sword. "Lady Eleonora of West Haven," he said, his voice now quiet, meant for her alone, yet heard by all. "You came to my kingdom as a hostage. You have endured scorn, suspicion, and a plot to take your life. Through it all you have shown more wisdom, courage, and loyalty to the true good of Eldoria than any who have stood in this hall for a generation." He went down on one knee before her. The entire court gasped as one. A king did not kneel. To anyone. "I have treated you as a pawn when you have always been a queen. I ask for your forgiveness, and I ask for your hand, not as part of a treaty, not as a political alliance, but as my partner, my wife, my queen. Rule with me, Eleonora. Help me build this new dawn." Tears she had refused to shed in the darkest despair of her cell now streamed freely down Eleonora's face. They were tears of shock, of relief, of a profound and overwhelming love. He saw her not as a symbol of surrender, but as his equal, his strength. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Theron." He rose, taking her hand and lifting it to his lips. He then turned to the stunned court. "Behold your queen," he proclaimed, his voice filled with a pride and joy no one had ever heard from him before. A hesitant cheer started, then grew into a thunderous roar of approval. They were cheering not just for a king and his new queen, but for the promise of a future they had never dared to imagine, a future of peace, forged not by a treaty of surrender, but by a partnership of 2 brilliant minds and 2 united hearts. The woman sold to a foreign kingdom had not just captivated the enemy king, she had helped him save it, and in doing so had found her own kingdom, her own home at his side. And so the woman who was sold for grain became the queen who cultivated an empire of peace. Eleonora and Theron's story is a testament to the fact that true power isn't found in crowns or conquered lands, but in the unbreachable fortress of 2 hearts and minds united as one. Theirs was not a fairy tale, but a hard-won history, proving that even in the darkest of times, love and courage can redraw the maps of the world. If their journey from enemies to allies, from captive to queen, captivated, you please don't forget to hit the like button. Share this story with someone who loves an epic romance, and subscribe to our channel for more tales of history drama and unexpected love. We'd love to hear your favorite moment in the comments below. What part of their story resonated with you the most?